We're living in dangerous times. Donald Trump, before becoming president for the second time, had almost 10 years of praising dictators, whether it was Duterte or Orban or Kim Jong-un or most infamously Vladimir Putin. Now that he is president again, he is turning on Ukraine and incredibly claiming that Ukraine invaded Russia rather than vice versa. He has, on the first day of his presidency, he pardoned the January 6 rioters, including those who were in jail for 18 years for conspiracy to overthrow the U.S. government, including those that had beaten police officers. Um, and by doing that, what he is essentially doing is affirming the use of violence. He's saying violence is okay if it is in service of me and my political interests. He's now weaponizing the Department of Justice, even using it as a way to get the mayor of New York to do what he wants by using the Justice Department to call for charges against the mayor of New York to be dropped, saying that they could be reinstated, implication being a quid pro quo. They could be reinstated if the mayor of New York doesn't do what Trump wants him to do. All along the way, Trump is praising Christians and conservative Christians. He's playing to a conservative Christian base and promising to return America to a time of Christian glory. And the most concerning thing in some respects of all of this is the fact that Christians, conservative evangelical Christians, are complicit within it. And among those are many conservative evangelical apologists, one of the most infamous being Frank Turek, who has a long history of promoting MAGA Christianity, including his close affinity and ties with Charlie Kirk of Turning Point USA. Just this morning, Turek posted a tweet that I think we really have to talk about, and that's what we're going to take a look at here. So here's the tweet. He posted a poll and he asks this question: were the Crusades a defensive or offensive war? Now, first of all, note that the question's an odd one because the Crusades are not a war at all. The Crusades is a term that refers to a period of 150, 200 years in high medieval history beginning in the year 1095. It's not a single war. But second, note that polls with that pose questions like this, they're not neutral. Think similarly if you were to post a poll saying when Germany invaded Poland, um, sorry, I should say when Germany went to war with Poland in 1939, was that a defensive or offensive war? That's not a neutral question. Simply by posing the question, you are standing against a particular dominant historical interpretation and you have a vested interest, presumably, in initiating a conversation or debate about that very uncontested fact. And it's similar here. The Crusades are an offensive war by any measure, insofar as you want to talk about the Crusades as a quote unquote war. Um, they're not defensive, but by posing the question, Turek is presumably wanting to point people into having a new conversation. And then he has this link. So the link then takes us here to his website where it says, "What about the Crusades? Myths and Facts." And this is a fellow wrote it named Steve Lee, where he wrote an article for the Apologetics Study Bible for students. And here's part of what he links to from his conversation, from his Apologetics Study Bible. And I want to highlight just a couple bits here. He says the Crusades were a defensive war. Crusading was an expensive and costly endeavor. The Crusades were defensive wars to stop Islamic military advancement. Christianity was able to survive this invasion and give us the world we have today in the West, a world in which we enjoy democracy and civil rights. This passage, the author, Steve Lee, wants us to believe that the Crusades were a defensive war for which we should be grateful because they stopped the advance of Islam, establishing democracy and civil rights. I'm not going to begin to deconstruct this, except to say, first of all, as somebody who taught church history for 20 years at a seminary, this is crazy talk. But I do want to give you one quote from Fulk of Chartres, who was at the First Crusade. And he's writing here in 1099, and this is what he said. He said, a great fight took place in the court and porch of the temples, where we were unable to escape from our gladiators. While they were unable to escape from our gladiators, many fled to the roof of the Temple of Solomon and were shot with arrows, so they fell to the ground dead. In this temple, almost 10,000 were killed. Indeed, if you had been there, you would have seen our feet colored to our ankles with the blood of the slain. What more shall I relate? None of them were spared, neither women nor children were spared. The First Crusade was initiated by Urban II in 1095 as an attempt to acquire land in the Middle East. And eventually, this resulted, even incredibly, in the sacking of Constantinople in 1204 by Western Christians, even though it was a Christian uh, territory. But here, in this passage, what we see is a clear description of what, by any measure today, would be called war crimes and would be called ethnic cleansing and would arguably be called genocide, the mass slaughter of civilians in an unprovoked war where Muslims had occupied this territory for centuries and Christians invaded it based upon Pope Urban's call in 1095 and his promise for plenary indulgences into heaven if people were to go on the Crusades. Um, that's the picture. When Steve Lee says, "Oh no," he implies they just did this out of the selflessness of their heart. No, they did it for booty, they did it out of boredom, and they did it to get a plenary indulgence into heaven. And the result were massive war crimes, which continue to be a stain on Western church history and to create a deep and ongoing divisive fissure between Muslims and Christians. This what Frank Turek is promoting and celebrating as a defensive war that secured Christianity, democracy, and civil rights. When people who are constant supporters of MAGA Christianity and Trump's authoritarianism and his courting of violence in order to promote his ideas, when they start retelling the narratives of Christian history and they want you to believe that the Crusades were an admirable defensive war, we better start paying attention.